Hi everyone, I'm Sarina Fazan, a journalist, producer, and the host of On the Record. In my career, I've covered many crime stories, and I'm fascinated by the justice system in our society. In this episode of our Law and Order series, I am joined by attorney Paul Sisco, criminal trial expert, and we are ready to go on the record. Paul, I always have a huge smile on my face when you come in. Such a fascinating conversation always. Thank you for coming back on the show.
Sarina, thanks for having me.
So, before we get started, and for those who may be meeting you for the first time, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and your background?
Well, I'm a Tampa kid. I've lived here over 50 years now, and over the last 30, I've worked as a lawyer, generally in the criminal justice system in Hillsborough and in the federal courts. I'm a former prosecutor, and then the last 24 years of my career, I've worked on the defense side, largely doing white-collar criminal defense, but also general criminal practice and civil practice.
Well, Paul, again, thank you so much for being here. At the beginning of the show, as you heard me say, I'm fascinated by the justice system, and we wanted to do a show to hopefully educate people out there, and I asked you to come in. What do you think we should be talking about?
Well, you know, what's interesting, Sarina, is you and I grew up with television shows from Perry Mason to Matlock to LA Law. You know, there is this fascination with the court system, detectives, cops, the accused, victims. And the reality is what the average American knows, unfortunately, is from television. Oftentimes when they get into the system for the first time, they're kind of seeing the actual dynamics of it, and they're a little confused that it doesn't quite match up with the episode of LA Law they might have recently watched. Mm-hmm.
So what does happen?
Well, you know, oftentimes, particularly in a criminal case, you know, you'll get client X is calling you on the phone, and you know, your assistant will say, he's got this kind of case. Do you want to talk to him or her about this? And you know, you'll early on in your career as a defense lawyer, you'd make the mistake of asking them how they're doing, and usually you're talking to somebody who's probably having the worst day of their life.
Absolutely, they must be scared out of their mind.
Yeah, and frequently it's somebody, particularly in white-collar cases, you know, here's an individual, and they're usually successful individuals, you know, someone who's had a good career making income, usually well-educated, no prior criminal history whatsoever, and maybe they've had a couple FBI agents show up at their workplace or on their doorstep for the first time. Or in the local state sort of criminal case, you know, they've been arrested, perhaps for the only time in their life that will happen, and they don't know where to go from here. And they're just looking for somebody, you know, it's just raining crisis and pain on them. Who's going to be my guardian? Who's going to help me through this? And so when you say, how are you? You know, you're liable to get a long answer, and, you know, you're talking to a person in crisis.
So what should a person in crisis, in, you know, one of these scenarios that you have described, what should they do?
Well, I can tell you what I like to do is I want to get to know that person, you know, learn about their family a little bit. I don't jump right into the facts all the time, because part of what we do, you know, we're attorneys and counselors at law. That's what it says on our business cards anyway, right? We're supposed to, in addition to being a professional that can help them apply the law, that's sort of a cold and sterile thing. You know, the more important part in many ways is to be somebody who can advise them in a way that tells them truthfully what the consequences and the circumstances they're in, but also isn't adding to that pain, right? I mean, they've got enough trouble. First of all, their liberty's at stake potentially. Their whole world's been turned upside down. They tend to be achievers, and all they're thinking, they're preoccupied now. They can't eat. They can't. Maybe they can't talk to their wife or their husband about what's going on. You know, employees of theirs want to know, hey, why were those guys in suits in your office? They've just got a lot of questions, and I think the first thing I like to do, get to know them, find out what that client wants. You know, it's not all about, hey, let's get out the sentencing guidelines and look at what you're facing, you know. And they've got concerns too financially, right? Because maybe their job has come to a halt. Maybe they've got to pay, you know, here's this lawyer, Paul, I'm going to pay him a bunch of money. What's it going to be for? You know, how am I going to pay for this? Be a counselor to them. Be somebody that from the very beginning, they know they can trust you for the answers to their really genuine concerns they have at that point.
Well, I want to talk to you about the financial aspect a little bit later. But for now, about choosing the attorney, and I want you to put modesty aside for a minute. You have really covered some high-profile cases. Again, modesty aside, can you tell us, before I ask the questions, some of the cases that you've actually handled? I use the word covered. I've covered them as a journalist, but some of the cases that you've handled.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been blessed. I mean, I feel like Forrest Gump sometimes. I've ended up in some places, you know, where how did I get into this? And I had an opportunity early on in my career as a prosecutor to handle a lot of cases, you know, homicides, you know, robberies, burglaries, attempted murders of law enforcement officers, and so on. Some fascinating stuff. And then on the defense side, when I went to work in private practice, I had the chance to work on what people know as the Henry Lyons trial. Mm-hmm. I represented a co-defendant named Bernice Edwards, who's now passed on. But as a young lawyer, I really was able to cut my teeth on that.
Before you go on, though, can you, for people who may not live in this area, because we actually get viewership all over, sure, can you just recap the Lyons case?
Sure. So I was at the state attorney's office at the time in Hillsborough, and there was a case that was covered back when newspapers were the primary source of sort of criminal courtroom news, not like it is today on the social media. Mm-hmm. And the Times and the Tribune at the time, the Tampa Tribune, every day were covering the investigation and the prosecution of a reverend by the name of Henry Lyons, who was the head of the National Baptist Convention for the Southeast. And the allegations were that he had embezzled through various schemes a large amount, millions of dollars in congregation money, and then misused it for his own purposes and such. I ended up having the alleged paramour of Mr. Lyons by the name of Bernice Edwards, and she was, by title, she was the public relations director for the National Baptist Convention at the time, but this was a case that had sort of captivated the nation. It was reported widely in magazines, mm-hmm, and so on, and now here I am. I think I was 30, maybe 31 at the time, and I'm suddenly in a case that's being covered by CNN, and the New York Times is on it, and so on. And so it's really a baptism by fire, but a blessing in disguise, as it turned out.
Well, I mean, talk about gaining a lot of experience and recognition from that case alone. And there's been many cases, but that is a good example to give people an idea of your background. So when someone, though, how important, of course, it's very important to choose the right attorney, but how do you choose the right attorney? And do you need someone with a background, you know, like yours?
So as you're saying that, it occurred to me that cases are like good dogs, right? Sometimes they find you, you know, mm-hmm, and like that one, for instance, that was a situation where, I don't know if you recall at the time, but one of the Kennedy relatives had recently had rape allegations brought against them.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And back in those days, you used to use a large volume book called Martindale-Hubbell, which still exists today in computer form, but you used to have to go in this book and you'd have to say, who's a lawyer I'm going to get in Tampa, Florida? You know, here's Bernice Edwards, for instance. She's up in Milwaukee at the time. She's about to be indicted or charged down in St. Pete. Who's a Tampa lawyer I want? So God rest her soul, I love Bernice, but Bernice being Bernice was thinking to herself, I want that person who defended the Kennedy person. And it was Roy Black, mm-hmm, very well-known lawyer in town, but she wasn't finding Roy Black and Martindale-Hubbell, but what she did find was my firm, Black & Jung, Tony Black and Bill Jung.
Wow.
And she ended up calling Tony, and Tony, you know, a very good lawyer, and Bill Jung in their own rights, said, well, I don't do criminal, but my partner Bill Jung does. And then I got hired by Bill and Tony, and Black and Jung, by a mistake essentially that was being made by the client, ended up being my case.
Isn't that something how that turned out?
Yeah, it was, like I said, it's a Forrest Gump existence. They kind of
Yes.
find you sometimes. I feel blessed. I've been able to be in the middle of some really nice cases.
Well, Paul, but for people out there, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show, and they find themselves in a situation like this, especially, in a white-collar case, oftentimes, as you mentioned, or someone arrested for the first time, worst day of their life, how do they find the right person?
This is one of the things that concerns me as a lawyer, honestly. I drive down the interstate and I see billboards and they demean our profession. We need to be professionals. And, I see signs, that brag about how big the firm is and so on. And people make life decisions based on that stuff. We put more time into the ingredients we're looking for tonight's dinner than we do on who's going to keep me from doing the rest of my life in prison, who's going to keep me from losing my house and my job. The way the average American sets out to pick their lawyer is really sort of a misleading and scary process. Many of the folks, they'll oftentimes come in to see you and they'll say, well, I thought about going to X. And you're thinking, oh my God, thank God you didn't. Not just because you're here, but you would have been crushed, I like to, when I'm talking to a client, I like them to know, look, there's not 200 lawyers here in this firm. What you're going to get is some individualized attention. You're going to have my cell number. And frankly, there's going to be many nights I'm not going to be able to sleep about your case because I'm thinking about it.
And that is the truth, right? It's not like, okay, well, I'm done, I'm clocking out.
Right.
You really do think about your cases.
Yeah, to the point where my wife will say, turn it off, And the reality is, like in many things, it's not just being a lawyer. The moment you quit caring or the moment you are no longer nervous to an appropriate level before a hearing, you're no good, right? You have to care. And the reality is that to be your best, at least for me, I sort of have to go to that dark place they're in right then and kind of feel that pain a little bit in order to try to get them out of it.
Well, you mentioned something just now when you said someone might come to your office and they think, they may have said, I'm going to call so-and-so, and you're thinking in your mind, oh my gosh, thank goodness. Right. Now, I'm not going to reveal any names, but I will say I covered two teachers in town here. Mm-hmm. Both of them were accused of sexual assault. Both very similar cases. One went with one attorney and another went with the other attorney. One teacher went to prison and another one did not. So,
yeah. And every case is different. The facts are different. And one of the things we sometimes do is we say, well, let's compare these because they're apples and apples. Many times the facts are slightly different in those cases. I will tell you this, in Tampa and in Pinellas, and the areas I work in, I'm always very happily surprised by the quality of the lawyers and also good people, right? People that took me under their wing early on, and sort of, they didn't have to. In fact, I was going to be a competitor later, and they showed me the way. And generally, like everything, most people are really good. But, there's the way in which lawyers are selected is somebody Googles lawyer, they're arrested on a DUI or, they're being investigated and they Google it, and you're just going to pull up the person who spent the most money, having someone who doesn't know what they're doing, make it so you're getting more hits on your site. I don't like advertising personally in the profession, but because word of mouth is so important, and I'd like to think that you're getting that next case because your prior case or your prior dozens of cases, those people somewhere along the line said, if you get in trouble, give Paul a call. Frequently during a week, the case isn't the right fit for me. It's something that is in another field in law, and I still want those people to get to the best person I would go to. I mean, frequently, I've did in the last week, I would say, look, if I had a family member in this situation, here's who I would go to. And I give them the name of someone I trust. And that's what we should do as lawyers. We've got a duty to the profession. We can't be as mercenary as we're often portrayed.
So many points, Paul. We're going to take a quick break and we're going to come back because I want to talk to you about, again, the financial aspect, but I also want to talk to you about the jury and the mind of the jury and picking the right jury. So we'll be right back. I'm Sarina Fazan, a journalist, producer, and podcast host. With a background in television news, I know how much time and talent it takes to produce a broadcast quality production. But no more. Red House Streaming offers a simple, cost-effective method for capturing live action and streaming it in real time to YouTube, Facebook, or any other website. From single camera shoots or multi-camera productions, conventional or virtual sets, and from the state-of-the-art Red House Streaming Studios to remote locations, the professional crew at Red House Streaming, backed by the technology and reputation of CP Communications, allows you to produce more content at a lower cost and with little to no engineering required. That's why my podcast, On the Record with Sarina Fazan, is streamed live from the Red House Streaming Studios each week. Contact Red House Streaming today at 800-762-4254 or online at cpcoms.com to learn more. I'll see you in the studio. Oh, we're back. I'm sorry. See, so Paul and I were so engrossed in our conversation during the commercial that I wasn't even paying attention that we were back. So Paul, why don't you walk us through a hypothetical situation, like from beginning to end?
Sure. So, okay, you have a person who is working, let's say, as a banker, and they work in an organization that might have 8 or 10 folks that are the normal players, right? You have the bank president, you have various vice presidents, one in marketing, and so on. And somewhere along the line, maybe there's a disgruntled employee inside the bank. And for whatever reason, right or wrong, they find themselves saying, either going to a lawyer themselves or saying, I'm going to call, the FBI and let them know what I'm seeing here. It usually starts with somebody who's disgruntled or somebody legitimately, concerned that wrongdoing's going on. And, you'll get a call perhaps after the FBI surfaces. It's the usual, federal agency that's involved. There's a series of other, 3 initial agencies that the feds have, or even on the state side. Usually starts with somebody gets a subpoena for some documents or some information. And now you have a person who can be anywhere on the spectrum. They know exactly what they're there for. Mm-hmm. That's the guy who knows, oh God, they finally got him. I was wondering when it was coming. You have the person who has a little bit of an idea of something they might be looking for based on what's in this subpoena. Or you have the person who's like, I have no idea what this is all about. And you can get any one of those folks, right? So you get a call on the phone and the person says, look, I'm told by my brother and my uncle that they're estates lawyers, and they say, I need a criminal lawyer for this. And so they'll call you. And the first thing you want to do is I want to see them face to face and as soon as possible. They have a deadline on that subpoena, but I want to see them hopefully that night or the next morning. And candidly, I'll go to their house if necessary, but I want that to happen quickly because time is of the essence. And I want to learn what they're looking for, kind of beat the bushes a little bit in town, call some of my colleagues, hey, are you hearing anything on this? Mm-hmm. And so, we have sort of a code among ourselves, it tends to be the same players frequently, and maybe I'm going to call my friend who's also an attorney that does this, and he's going to say, hey, Paul, I can't talk to you about this. I have so-and-so. And, we'll let each other know if there's a conflict. But frequently, there will be a investigation going on where now there's a group of folks that are targets or subjects of an investigation. And then there's the so-called usual suspects we'll see that are the lawyers I tend to work with in Tampa on the white-collar side. And very bright people. And you're generally dealing with very bright people who are the targets or subjects, and their lives have been turned upside down. Maybe they're coming here and they're saying, hey, Paul, I haven't been told whether or not I'm going to be indicted or not, but they took my new boat and they seized one of my bank accounts. And what's this going to cost me? And when's this going to be over? And you're like I always feel sort of like a pain doctor in a way at that time. They want to know, what's going to make their uncertainty go away, but what's going to make my pain go away also, right? I mean, these people are suffering,
Mm-hmm.
Here's achievers generally, and they and they maybe haven't even told their wife what's happening yet, that the FBI's shown up, and maybe they haven't told them what wrongdoing they think they might be involved in. So there's a whole series of sort of, it's almost like the 12 steps of dying we used to talk about. You know, sometimes there's an anger at first, and then there's an acceptance and all that. They go through that. But they see me and us as a sanctuary in a sense. Like when you come to see me, it's not raining on your head anymore, right? It's we're here to talk about how to make this better, not to make it worse. Because the whole idea, particularly of federal prosecutions, is make this as painful as possible for this person so they give us what we want, which is essentially a plea. And they will use every resource they can, including threatening prosecution of family members, in order to make it happen. They're generally good folks, but it's one of the lawful tools, sort of the distasteful tools you see happen. Put as much pressure on this person as you can to get what we want. And you've got to kind of take them and be their protector at that point. Do what's best for them. And sometimes it's setting up an interview with the feds. Sometimes it's resisting altogether that, telling them, I don't see anything there. Let's make them show us something. But really what we are, like in many professions, you're kind of a psychologist to begin with, right? You got to read the room a little bit. What do we have here? And then you got to see what's actually there.
Well, you know, it's such a scary scenario, especially I think when you're talking about, you know, white collar crime, right? Because I honestly I had a friend of mine who the FBI knocked down their door at 3 o'clock in the morning and arrested her husband.
Sure. And
she had no idea. And he really felt like it was a gray area, right? And it's a different type. It's a different type of. Well, I'm even at a loss of words.
But to your point, though, and I enjoyed when I saw this just because it educated the public. You know, the federal world's a little different. You know, there's not cameras allowed in the courtroom generally. You know, we get sort of bad artist renderings. I've got a bad one in my office where I look a little like a strange person. But because there's sort of this mystery about the federal system, what they don't realize is frequently it can be a bully of a system. We saw it, you know, regardless of what we think about people like Roger Stone who are arrested. When you see, you know, 20 or 30 armed SWAT-style uniforms going to arrest a 74-year-old guy in his bathrobe. That's not because they're worried that guy's going to walk out with an M16 and a grenade. That's because we're going to scare the holy hell out of them. And this is what tends to work, what is generally says, this is our way of showing, listen, we're big and we've got unlimited resources and we're going to keep coming at you until you give us what you want. That was not an unusual situation. That happens all the time, okay? And so when they're barging through the door at 3 o'clock in the morning, listen, it's even easier for them to wait until 8 o'clock to do it, okay? But they know you're gonna come out, you're groggy, and they've got you at your weakest point. And folks don't realize the extent to which that happens. You know, I'm as I've said on other shows with you, I'm of the belief, I don't like the government, I don't trust the government generally, and I sure as heck don't believe there's pure motives when they're coming to someone's house in the middle of the night. That's all about intimidation and, frankly, a legal form of extortion in a sense.
Well, sadly, as you mentioned, it does work though sometimes. I mean, people are scared out of their mind.
It works most of the time. You know, it works, in fact, it works most of the time. Those people roll over and then they regret having had that, you know, that pre-lawyer interview they've done with the FBI. They regret what they've said or why they've said it, and it's all designed that way as part of the plan. What's going to get those folks to talk the quickest and without a lawyer? You know, and the evolution is always the same. It's something like, well, they told me I didn't need a lawyer. You know, it would be in their best interest for me to talk to them, and of course they say that because it's in the law enforcement's interest for you to talk to them. But the reality is, whether the person's innocent, guilty, or somewhere in between, and then usually somewhere in between, there's a gray area as to whether or not they've actually violated a law or not. They sure shouldn't be talking to law enforcement, particularly when they're in their living room at 3 in the morning.
Absolutely, you're not at your best, certainly at
Right.
that time. How important is it, because I teased this too, the psychology of a jury and picking the right jury? And you're right about, of course, as a journalist, we were never allowed any cameras in there, you
Right.
know, and so you really had to rely on the note taking and, you know, being creative in the scripts, and that's why a lot of federal cases don't get covered by television, because we
No.
do it through pictures.
Right, they don't, because it doesn't have the quality video, you know, that the producer wants. Hey, I want to, you know, sometimes you'll get them, that's why you see so many courtroom step shots,
Right,
right, coming
right.
out of the courtroom. Well, what happened in the courtroom? And then you get the bad artist rendering of the Unabomber or whoever it was. But they want it like that. We should be entitled to see what's going on in those courtrooms. But the problem with jurors potentially in white collar cases, Sarina, is because of TV and the way we've sort of seen how crime's handled over the years. I think the average juror thinks that in federal court, that if I convict this person of this white collar crime, he's just going to get probation, he's going to pay some restitution back. What they don't realize in federal court is the federal sentencing guidelines are incredibly draconian, heavy, and they're getting heavier. You're almost always going to prison on a federal conviction, almost always. And the common juror doesn't know that. And a lot of people don't know this either. Generally speaking, the juror doesn't know what the sanctions are that they're about to convict someone of. In fact, you're prevented from telling them, look, if you convict this person, he's going to have a 10-year minimum mandatory, you know. If they knew that, and they do take their role seriously, but it's a little harder to convict, I believe, if you know the sanction's going to be more extreme.
Absolutely. I think if a juror is well educated and knows what's going to happen,
Right.
you know, you take all of that information,
Yes.
and hopefully, you know, come back.
Yeah, and you know, many times you'll get a call or some communication with the permission of the court from a juror, or you'll see them in Publix years later, and the impression they have as to what happened with that person is just shocking. You know, they're just blown away many times as to what the ramifications would have been.
Like, so surprised finding out, oh yeah, they did go to prison for 20 years,
Sure,
or they did.
Or even realizing that that was a possibility. You know, it's many times, you know, you'll see somebody and they'll be very complimentary and they'll say something nice, and you'll say, oh, I do remember you on that panel. But I think there's in the common populace, I think there's just a belief that financial white collar type crimes, those don't involve prison, and they absolutely do.
Well, let's talk about too the financial aspect of it, though. Like, how in the world I mean, of course, a lot of people have savings, I guess, but how do they pay for it?
Well, also an important consideration for the lawyer, frankly, because you're making a business decision also. Mm-hmm. And, you know, these aren't 1 or 2 day DUI cases, right? These are long investigations, usually long pre-indictment investigations. You know, they might take 2 or 3 years before a decision is made as to whether to prosecute it. You're working that whole time, knowing what witnesses are going to say, interviewing them, working with other lawyers. Then you post-indictment, you know, a myriad of other time that goes into it. I mean, you might have the better part of, you know, 2,500 hours put into a case by the time one of them's done. And, you know, you can really do yourself a disservice by underestimating the value of your time. You know, these cases, you know, I think about eras in my life. Oh, this is when my son was born, this is when my daughter was born, but I also have, oh yeah, this is when I took care of Bernice, this is when I did this, and they're eras, you know. Many times these cases cover years, and they take a significant part of your life, and that's a large amount of money sometimes that you're asking from them, but they're taking a large part of your life
too, right? And you are potentially saving their life from going to prison, or, you know.
You want to be fair.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be fair to them, and you want to be fair to yourself, and they deserve that from you. Also, there's what you see over time also is there's many people that will do a case for less. There's many people that will do a case for more. You want to find the sweet spot of that person who's going to care about that case like you're their family member, you know, and you're going to take care of them. And, you know, the anxiety and the late hours and oh, I forgot to do this because I was preoccupied with this case, that's got to get figured in there somewhere. And that definitely happens. It takes a toll and it has a value. And you're doing them a real service by pricing the case correctly too.
For them. So, I have to say, in full disclosure to the audience out here, our team relies a lot on Paul Sisco. We are like, Paul, okay, I got my first national producer credit this year, and I said,
right.
Oh my gosh, Paul, for Joe Exotic Tiger's Eyes and Cover. I'm like, Paul, can we interview you for that? We have another client out there that's an attorney who wants a show, and I said, Paul, can we call you in and interview you for that? So I said, Paul, while you're here, it was actually Audra Butler's idea, who's the executive producer. Well, she does so many things for the show. She's like, wow, well, we have Paul here. Let's do a show with him. So I appreciate it.
Wow.
So that's why the show is all over the place. But it's so great to always talk to you because you give us such great advice.
Well, I'm honored to be here. You know, it's sort of a, as you get to be the old get off my lawn guy, you start to realize there's certain universal truths that apply. And just really what we're doing is we're interacting with people. And, the law is a significant part of it, and the courtroom's a significant part of it, but you become part of become part of this family's lives and the existence in maybe the worst period in their lives. And that's difficult sometimes, but it's an honor to be the person selected to help them through it.
Well, I will say this on the record. I hope I never have to call you for one of those instances, but we'll always call you to come back on the record with us.
I get that a lot. Yeah. I don't ask how you're doing, and and they're like, I hope to see you soon, at a Christmas party, but not this.
Absolutely, back on this set. Well, everyone, that brings us to the end of another episode of On the Record. And thank you, Paul, again so much for sharing your story and your insight. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can always follow me on all my social media platforms, and you can subscribe to this podcast. I always love seeing this because I'm like, really? I have all those platforms? And you can subscribe, and you can never miss an episode. Until next time, stay safe, everyone.
Thanks, Sarina.